Welcome to Breaking Banks Africa. I'm Matteo Rizzi, and together with my co-host Nadine Zoro, let us take you on a journey of entrepreneurship, innovation, and vibrant ecosystems Africa has to showcase. More than 1 in 4 people will be African by 2050, this continent being already the youngest of the planet. You can't miss these stories. This is Breaking Banks Africa. Let's roll. Hey guys, welcome back to Breaking Banks Africa. This is episode number 4. I am Matteo Rizzi, the executive producer of the show, and for the 4th time, I'm here with my co-host Nadine Zoro. Nadine, hey, how are you?
Hello, Matteo. How are you? I'm great. Nice to see you again, and nice to be in this 4th episode together.
Great. So today, as we say in Italian, and I'm not sure I can translate that in English, I play at home. And I play at home because I'm here with my friend John Brittell, co-founder and CEO of Sideway Ventures. John, welcome to the show.
Really good to be here, Matteo, and good to see you. And thanks for inviting me on the show.
So I play home because John and I are in business together. I am honored to be the entrepreneurial residence of Sideway Ventures, in one of the many hats that I wear. And the reason why we wanted to have John enter the show in this particular conversation is because I believe that the way you are thinking on building ventures and investing in ventures in Africa is different. So please take a couple of minutes about, to tell us about your background and also what Side Ventures is, please.
Absolutely. So originally from San Francisco, California. Parents were technologists, so I kind of come from that background. And of course, after university, I decided to go a totally different path and went finance and ag specifically, and found myself in DC for about 10 years working in finance, but for kind of quasi government, U.S. government organizations. And that kind of led me, with DC being such a melting pot for every country in the world, it just kind of opened my eyes to other markets. I ended up living and working in Prague in the Czech Republic, did a lot of travel, and sort of came across a volunteer opportunity with a group that was trying to raise money for Africa. And it was to do sponsorships and education, and it was around entertainment. So it was really easy to get involved with. So that's kind of the beginning of it. And that was 21, 22 years ago. And I've been here ever since. There's been a lot of back and forth. So I did come from sort of a finance background my whole life. I've always been fundraising, but just in different organizations, historically for NGOs and, in media and housing. And then it kind of transitioned into, the industry that we're in today. So that's a little bit about myself. I did a bachelor's at UC Davis in agricultural economics and statistics. Went back to do my master's about 15 years ago. And I got an MBA in finance, and then also got a master's in international affairs. I was thinking about being a diplomat. And then chose the private sector, which is where we are today. I sit on the board for the American Chamber of Commerce here in Uganda. So we do a lot of work with the U.S. Embassy. And then, of course, I sit on the board for Cavendish University, and I focus on rebuilding their curriculum and creating an endowment for them, which would be the first endowment here in Uganda for a private university. So that's a little bit about myself. So really glad that you invited me, and it's good to see you here. And I didn't know you did this, so this is great.
No, and like before giving the mic to Nadine, tell us a little bit about, or let's share maybe together, our approach to venture building, right? Because there is a lot of ways that today you can nurture and help a startup to grow. I believe that the way Side B does it is a bit different. So how did you come up with the idea, and what did it take? A couple of minutes to talk about it, please.
Yeah, so this is actually it's an evolution, right? And so it's a lot of trial and error. I didn't know this coming in. It's not like I had a vision for it from the beginning. I've been in the trenches working with companies, and we were doing corporate advisory for about 10 to 12 years prior to this. And towards the end of that season, I guess, we started looking a lot more early stage opportunities. And it had everything to do with funds being created for early stage, innovation hubs that needed to support early stage, universities and corporates who wanted to come together to support early stage. So we did a lot of work there. And when I transitioned from corporate advisory into early stage advisory, one of our board members had suggested that we go in that direction. So we followed that path with the intent of creating a fund, because capital is one of the big constraints for the market at that early risk level. So this was how we kind of started our journey. And I think if you look at it, when you look at my first advisory company here, it was specifically on SME ag. Obviously, those guys can't afford it. So you're kind of going into a market where it's a little bit limited from an advisory perspective, but you can see the inner workings of how these SMEs work. And then you get into the corporate space, which is much more defined. But again, you see sort of certain characteristics on financial statements and how the businesses operate and run in these markets, which is very different than you'd probably find in Western or US markets. And then you look at the early stage guys, and again, you see these trends of how they look and how they're structured, and you see it over and over. This isn't something that you just see once. These are common, everyday issues that sort of come up, whether it's specifically, these are issues around cap tables, this is issues around business partners versus tech partners, these are issues around cap raising, right? So they're the same over and over, literally repeated over and over. And so that was the impetus for us coming into this. So when we look at the way that what we sort of consider as origination, we were looking at incubators, we were looking at accelerators, we were looking at studios, we were looking at individual challenges, we were looking at demo days, we were looking at all kinds of methods that people were drawing in capital to early stage, and sort of refining how that should or could be done here. So we wanted to start a really big partnership with Techstars and bring them onto the continent and be the first fund supporter of them on the continent. And then there was a huge implosion internally, obviously, with their CEO, and we couldn't go on with them. So that's what kind of pivoted us over to start our own. There's a whole story about that. I can get into that. But basically, we look at this from an origination play. How do you reduce the cost on a per unit basis of finding and working with founders and new ideas and new companies that are on the market? And we think that if you use the traditional approach of VC, and right now in Africa, it's a very helicopter approach. People coming from abroad, you helicopter, pinpoint, dig a little bit, and that's kind of your web. We kind of have a different approach because we're on the ground, right? We have people that are here. We are very much embedded at many levels of society, in the community. We have a much different view on things than I think somebody from the outside. So that's a little bit about it. I'm happy to get into like more details. There's a bunch of stories behind how we got here.
No, and Nadine, this is also like your daily bread, right? Because on the top of being our part-time host, you are also the founder of Impact Hub. So you know a lot about working with entrepreneurs. This mutualizing the common needs, that is basically everything that is not product. Market and sales, but is as a common ground that can be mutualized. So I think that a lot of what John said resonate a lot, right, Nadine?
100%. And I think there are some of the questions I would need to ask him. How do you reduce those costs? How do you make sure entrepreneurs locally, especially, understand the value of the support that you're giving them, and how much it costs and how much it takes as resource from you to support them? So maybe I don't have an answer myself, but I have some questions for you, John, on what do you think are some misconceptions or myths that we have about startups in Africa that the general public of a global scene thinks about startups in Africa?
Sure. I want to answer that question, but I kind of want to preface the fact that we're talking about this in the context, and Matteo is involved in the Side B Venture Studio, which its model is this evolution of the answer to this question. And it is those misconceptions, it's those challenges, it's the things that we see based on the advisory we were doing that is drawing about the way that we're going about origination through this venture studio model. So it is a hybrid venture studio model. It's a mix between a traditional accelerator and a traditional studio. We literally in the middle in terms of time, equity, hiring versus not hiring, our participation from an operating side. And our fundamental value proposition to the founder is that we will alleviate your back-end operational burden, HR, finance, legal, administration, and allow you to focus on customers, market, product, right? Any revenue generating activity you focus on will deal with all this back-end stuff. Founders don't need specialists in accounting. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of our value prop, and we want to do that in a 12-month period. We want to take founders from usually around 50 to 100K up to $1 million in revenue in 1 year, and we have the capacity to do that. So that's our fundamental value prop to founders, and that's how the studio is structured. And so we have 4 levels of teams that we work with. So we've got a whole fund team, which is separate from the studio. We've got a venture team, which Matteo is a part of. We have an operating team, which just deals with all the back end for the founders in the studio. And then we have a coaching and mentoring team, which is industry specific. So each founder gets a single mentor, which is specific to that industry. This is a senior guy who's been around, 3-4 decades in that specific industry, and can kind of share some pretty good insights into what's happening. So that's how we're structured. So if you think about that, and then you think about, okay, well, what are the challenges? The studio is intended to answer those challenges and kind of provide a resource for that. We think there's 3 fundamental challenges, which we don't see incubators doing, we don't see accelerators doing, we don't see hubs doing, we don't see ESOs, these entrepreneurial support organizations, we don't see them doing these things. So 3 things are: 1, you don't have industry specific support. So you have generalist support or program related support. So that means somebody maybe come from a theory-based methodology, or maybe have heard it or read about it. And those are the people that are helping startups. So you can imagine you're already at a disadvantage, right? And the second thing is capital, right? Risk capital specifically. And in Africa, this, generational wealth is non-existent. Well, it's just coming to its first generation, basically, across the board, post-colonial era, right? So even families that have started solid businesses here have lasted maybe 1 or 2 generations, and then they die out. And so that ongoing generational wealth doesn't seem to stay in place, except for a select few. And so without that, you don't have long-term capital accumulation. You don't have long-term, even though you have high savings rates, you don't have high accumulation. So there's a difference between the two. And that's what allows risk capital to sort of flow. And this is why you can see, a $10, $50 million deal in the States kind of go pretty easy, or 100 million raise kind of happen pretty quickly, because people can part with that without denting their lifestyles or their pocketbooks, right? So that's the second thing. And the third thing are partnerships, and partnerships in the context, the way we're building this is partnerships in the context of customer. And so the number one thing that we believe that most founders need are the people to buy their products and services, right? And there is a belief that, and this is sometimes founder led, that they want to figure out their product first. And we get that, like, it's totally legitimate. And they want to go through every loop, possible to figure out like whether or not that product really is the thing that they want to go forward with before they even get to a rev model. If you're capitalized, not a problem. So some people are capitalizing to do that. But for the most part, like 99% of the other ones who aren't capitalized, that's really difficult to take that time to do that. So we think that the way we've set it up is we have a lot of corporate partnerships that we've set up to drive customer base with their customers. And also some of them have certain technology they've already established. So how do we link into that technology, and how do we get API access and other support services to link into the services that our founders are creating? So we think those are the 3 main things. And those are the three things that we're driving at the studio, in addition to that functional back-end operational stuff. So we're a little bit of a mix. So we're a little different. So if you think about that, the cost structure of us to function is very high. You can't price us at a rate of an incubator and accelerator. It doesn't make sense. So that cost factor is super, super high. And that's kind of a big
It makes
factor.
me it makes me think that and I always had it in mind that this this approach kind of is a byproduct of the fact that the pure VC business in Africa is not adapted for the majority of the startups that are fundraising, right? Because you expect a VC doesn't expect to babysit right the entrepreneur in the same way that
Good point.
that may be exactly that
Yeah.
that she needs as simple as that.
We just had a conversation with another VC partner. They're from France. And this is good for us, Matteo. I didn't update you, but we think they might want to come in on a fund, and they understand it. They're okay with fund to funds. And when we were speaking to them, you could tell the frame within which they were speaking was exactly what you were saying. I'm gonna see a deck. It's a good idea. I'm gonna give you money. You do what you said you were going to do and spend the money on the thing you said you were going to spend the money on, and I will walk away and come back to you in a quarter or 6 months or whatever and get an update. That traditional model can't happen here. So one of the things we do in the studio, which is super important to understand, is we propose and we suggest heavily that we take over your bank accounts. We literally own your bank. I am the signatory on your bank account, meaning I know where every single payment goes. You can't buy a house. You can't buy a car. You can't buy land. You can't spend it on your girl. I'm going to know if that happens. And what we find is young founders don't like that. If you're new in the space, it's like, I should own it's my money. What we find are seasoned founders appreciate that because they know that working with a third-party CEO or a CEO under their belt, there's leakage, even with somebody in their firm who they think they trust. And you find out that the more seasoned founders have been through the experience of being defrauded by their own people in Africa. So this is a very common thing that you wouldn't find as much in the West because the trust factor in the cultural distance is so much lower than you find here. The cultural distance here in Africa is, wide. And you know this, Nadine.
Yeah.
You cannot speak against the leader of your country, right?
It's also like on the origin of the startups themselves. Like if you look at country like ours, the founders that are thinking of venturing into startups, the young one, are generally people who didn't make it to get a good job, right? Starting a startup is an alternative for employment. They don't see it as, they see it like, I'm going to get rich very quickly. And I hear those nice stories. I just need to come up with some fun idea and I can get rich very fast. So with that in mind, they are not coming from a growth perspective. They are coming from a get rich perspective and get rich quick. So when you see a venture capital is bringing millions of dollars, something that you've never heard about, of course, you think about how quick you can get rich, and that doesn't turn out as well.
And don't even say millions. Just say a few hundred thousand. Just say a few 100,000.
Even 5,000.
So actually, guys, because I forgot to mention it, and I wanna make it clear for our listeners, is that so I'm right now in Ghana because I'm attending a conference for a Moja Loop conference funded by the Gates Foundation, and as you know, Nadine is in Ivory Coast, and you, John, are in Uganda. Actually, I think that if you take out the main markets, which are actually probably capturing 80 to 85% of all the VC money that comes to Africa, right? And, Kenya, Nigeria, maybe Egypt, South Africa, of course. Do you think that the less mature is the ecosystem, the more the traditional approach of VC is completely useless, in my opinion. And actually, curiously enough, I actually think, Nadine, that Ivory Coast and Uganda, for some reason, are actually similar markets. So there are like fintech is not, let's say, completely absent, but is starting. The potential is huge. The talent is huge. Main market, that in what main market in East Africa and West Africa, respectively. So it would be interesting to understand, what are the similarities, but. And if we go down, I don't know if you both agree with me, if you go down to even less mature market, then even what being an entrepreneur means, become a good way to help local businesses.
For me, it's just, I think the first question is here, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, most startups, even most companies, don't have any idea of what a startup is, right? So just the basic level of what is a startup, what does a startup do, and how they're supposed to grow is already a challenge. So supporting startups starts with that level. And I think that's what you touch, is what is entrepreneurship? What are we trying to achieve with it? And how do we make sure we achieve that? So it's the biggest challenge I think we see in the market, the basis. So a lot of entrepreneurs, or even like a lot of ESOs, when we work with entrepreneurs, we generally start by the smallest and the lowest principle about what entrepreneurship is, what it's supposed to build. And before we even get to fundraising, I think getting to fundraising is a huge step. There are so many steps before, and you get only maybe 5, 10, 20. If we get investors coming to Cote d'Ivoire and they contact us, and we tell them, I can only present to you 3 startups. I don't have that many that I think are investment ready or even close to getting investment ready. So that's also, I think, a big issue of our market and what is available there. I don't know, John, what you think about Uganda? Is it the same?
Yeah, I have. Look, I have a very different view. I've been on both sides of the equation. I think I really like the title of this. I love how Matteo marketed this, and that I am the one who's speaking here, because I started in a space of development, which was aid, and in the context of grants and DFIs, basically. So I did that from pre-DFI, so in the grant context, foundation grant, and then I went into a DFI. Used to work at OPIC, which is now DFC, is the United States foreign government arm for private sector investment. And then now I'm looking at this through the lens of purely private capital. We don't have any DFI capital. We don't have any public money, which we pride ourselves on. We're doing this purely privately. I'm knowing both sides. I tend to think that if you have to tell somebody about entrepreneurship, they're not an entrepreneur. And so if entrepreneur for me is somebody who can raise capital, if you can't do that, then you're not an entrepreneur. If you don't have access to capital, you're not an entrepreneur. Just because you have an idea or you're really smart doesn't make you an entrepreneur, right? And I think that's the idea behind entrepreneurship. I think you have issues around team. How do you pull people together? I think that's what defines entrepreneurship. And then the next point is how do you make it work? Entrepreneurs with ideas who can't make things work, I don't think are entrepreneurs. So if you define it through that lens, which is a training lens, which comes sort of from a donor rhetoric, you tend to move in that direction of defining, and we don't do that. You can kind of see pretty clearly when you're speaking to somebody whether or not they're on their A game, or if they're just trying to figure things out, and so I don't associate entrepreneurship with age, or I don't associate it with that. I do associate it with experience, ability to do those things. So that's the way we look at it. So it's
which
a little bit different.
which is also, John, the reason, and I think that's also makes your approach unique, is that for someone to get into the venture studio, he has to be not a first-time entrepreneur. So and again, I'm not saying that this is the only approach that is needed, right? Because it would be too easy only to help the best. But certainly, if you want to make a startup a triple or quadruple their IRR, be able to, quickly monetize your investments so that you make your exercise sustainable. Obviously you can't teach entrepreneurship. You have to teach sales. You have to teach product market fit. Or really you have to. And for having talked to every startup that you guys are now dealing with, you can see the difference when you get someone who has already built and maybe like smash their face against the wall a couple of times. It doesn't necessarily mean to build successful startups, but certainly if you have to, I agree with you, if you have to explain the basics, not that it's not needed, right? But then you can't, it's another work.
But
Here
that's not
we are
for
talking.
us.
Exactly. This is which is like appreciable. What we are saying here is that we need another model that is not the VC one for Africa to put together with the current models.
I would say, Matteo, I think what we're looking at here, though, is a little bit of a hybrid, right? So we're saying hybrid venture studio. I think if we look at what we have in terms of our founders and who's come in and out and why they've come in and out and the fact that there are some pretty good opportunities out there, I think you do have room in our model because we're only letting 5 founders in for a single studio for a single year, right? I think you do have room, and you can imagine that we're already talking about exit opportunities on 3 of those founders right now at the beginning. So we're already speaking exit. That's very uncommon, right? Most people are trying to figure out, well, where are we going to go? Like, we're screening for that. But I think there is something where we can be a little flexible and say, look, can 1 or 2 of those founders be really earlier stage and lean in on the more experienced guys, because there are network effects, and you do have that learning that needs to happen at some point, because you do need to kind of inculcate that younger or less experienced guys to come into the system. So I think this is why we let in a couple guys that you know about, Matteo. We had an ad tech that was in, which is super young, but and then we're looking at another AI company, which is super young, but like, the reason we can do that is because we've got a clear sense of the more experienced founders. So you have to have some kind of a portfolio approach when you're going at this. I really don't think this is a one size fits all. We have to be a little bit flexible. So this allows some flexibility for us to talk to people who are a bit younger in terms of their maturity of the firm. And I think now that I bring that up, if you look on our website, we ended up doing a lot of research on this. So we worked for the Kingdom of the Netherlands in the embassy here, but we worked with the Netherlands as well over in The Hague. And one of the things they were looking at was, how do they reallocate resources into things that generate jobs? When you look at what they had to figure out, like, well, what are people spending money on right now? And what we found is, in the Uganda market specifically, every year, $4 billion US, which is approximately 8 to 10 GDP points for the country, is spent on 2 things: agriculture and training. And when you spend money on those things, you can't create jobs, unfortunately. And so that was the conversation, that's a lot of money. So how do you allocate maybe 10% of that over to early stage? $400 million into the market of early stage would do a pretty big thing. And I think the impact would outweigh, based on the 4 billion or 3.6 you'd spend on ag and training. This stuff doesn't create jobs. So this was a conversation they sparked. We got together with around 18 Western donor country markets: US, France, Japan, Korea, all of them, UN, some multilaterals as well, World Bank, EU, UN. And we were we're still part of a working group that's trying to reallocate resources to early stage. So there is room for that sector, but you also don't want them to do it in a way that kind of looks the way it does right now when it comes to DFIs and grant people. So you have to be a bit careful with how you do that. And yeah, it's a work in progress. It's not perfect right now, but the infra here, I saw another post. It's just so far back, and when you think about linking the people and markets and basic supply chains and basic infrastructure to, and I'm not saying infrastructure in terms of like roads. I'm saying like, how many suppliers are linked together and how many vendors are linked together and do people speak to each other, like that kind of infrastructure, which is sort of pre-existing in terms of if somebody wants to buy into a product, it's like they tell their friends and everyone knows about it. You don't have that here in the same way.
Actually,
So things are
Dean,
a little bit.
I wanted to ask you, do you see any similar model, or do you think that the Francophone Africa, because you're still talking about 400 million people, right, is is ready for such an approach, or let's say that it's a couple of steps behind in the sense that if today you had to put multiple times entrepreneur in a place, give them some capital, you would know who to talk to. What's your take, Nadine?
On this, actually, sorry, Matteo, I wanted to talk more about the ecosystem building part of it because I see in Cote d'Ivoire a lot of new venture studios actually are coming with this model, something similar. And what we observe is that there's a very big issue when it comes to local content. Now, what they're bringing is seasoned foreigners that are CEO of these companies that are starting these companies because they have already found a startup. And behind me as a local, when I look at all these companies, I'm like, is there no value in this economy? People go to school, they have value that they can bring. So for me, I'm always worried about the culture of elitism that we are creating around startups, where it's like people that are not the general market, the mass market doesn't have space to get in. And that's where, for me, the biggest work is how do we position the mass market, get the good people out of there, train them, give them the right training and the right mindset that they need to have, because we are not coming from the same place. We don't have the same mindset. And the kind of mindset that we have locally here is not an entrepreneurship mindset. Like you go to school, you get a job for the government, and that's it. You get paid and you live with it.
I agree with you because we kind of act in that capacity as sort of a foreign body or a foreign entity coming in, and we are mixed, right? We've got Africans in America, we've got Italians in Portugal, we've got German people in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, we've got Ugandans in Uganda. I've got Kenyans in Uganda. So it's very much a global feel. I honestly don't think you can build a team purely ethnically clean, like pure, like that. Just to me, I've never been in a company where there's not diversity, where there's not people from every single country or continent. Like this is normal. So to favor anyone, I don't think is the right language. This idea that we have to own it here in Africa, I'm not really in favor of. I think I don't think you want it from an imperialist perspective, like that extreme, and that's not what we're going. That's not where we're going with this. But I can understand why there's this pushback to the complete other extreme side. If you're coming from a post-colonial regime or a post-imperialist regime. But for the most part, I feel like we have to be somewhere more in the middle. And how do we do that in a way that's a bit more smart is by balancing this, by giving founders here who aren't as experienced a chance, which is what we're trying to do. In addition to the fact that we have some more experienced guys behind us. So there's a mix that has to happen, right?
Nadine, now I feel like that this conversation leaves so many, stones unturned, and we should probably talk more about this initiative, and we will. What do you think? I think we should.
I think there's so much more to say about this. I'm part of another project, the Develop Ventures project with GIZ. And we did some due diligence a couple of weeks ago. And I was going through all of these companies and I had these questions. I was like, we have local companies. We don't see, I wanted to see local startups. I wanted to see local founders also as part of it. And we could see the disconnect in some of it. So there are good sides to it. They have a lot of expertise and learnings that they are bringing in. But as a person that has also this global view and being able to navigate between all of these ecosystems, and also a local person who grew up here, I can also see some of the disconnect. So I think there are a lot we can talk about, and it would be great. I think if we can get John again on board, and we can add maybe somebody else from this ecosystem to talk about that specific question.
My main analyst is a French speaker, so just FYI.
Yeah, so we can do it in French.
No, and I was actually thinking that it would be amazing. You mentioned GIZ, and we probably want to do a show with the like of African Development Bank, GIZ, the Catalyst Fund from Luxembourg, because there is this aspect of pushing the local entrepreneurs, but at the same time, we need the right diversities. Otherwise, you only get a bunch of non-fundable startups, at least in the traditional VC context, which is less of a building and more, hey, here's the money, we come back in 7 years, give us 10 times that, which I'm not sure it works in Africa. Nadine, I'll let you wrap up.
Thank you, Matteo, and thank you, John. I think this is such an insightful conversation. I don't want it to end. We need like 3 hours to talk about this topic, and we learned so much from you, John, and this very creative and new way of addressing the funding gap in Africa, especially when it comes to startups. So it was very great having you. For everybody listening to us, please stay connected. We'll be here very soon with episode number 5 of Breaking Banks Africa. Have a great day, everyone.
John, thank you very much. And this is a wrap.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Banks Africa, a Provoke Media podcast in cooperation with timepledge.org. Don't forget to share us out or shout out across social media. If there is something or someone you would like to hear on our cast, let us know. See you next month on Breaking Banks Africa.